Hello, it's HunterHexin here. Today I will analyze all enemies, bosses, soldiers, and playable characters in the upcoming game Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity. I'll start with enemies. In the original Hyrule Warriors, there were three enemy types: swordsmen, archers, and heavies. Swordsmen were the basic 1v1000 enemy. The archer was the same kind of basic enemy, but with a bow. Then there are the heavy enemies, which have lots of health and deal lots of damage. If you hit one of the enemies when they're vulnerable, they get a weak point gauge. When you hit the gauge a certain amount of times, you will do a special attack which does lots of damage to the heavy and surrounding enemies. Due to the footage we have on Age of Calamity, we can see 4 kinds of normal enemies, and 9 if you count different versions of already existing normal enemies. The Bokoblin, Stalkoblin, Blue Bokoblin, Black Bokoblin, Lizalfo, Stal Lizalfo, Ice Lizalfo, Ice Choo-Choo, and Yiga Foot Soldier. Some of these basic enemies might be more powerful than others, but for the most part, they will all have the same difficulty. There will probably be other elemental variants of basic enemies that we haven't seen yet, like a Fire Lizalfo. Now, in the trailer, we can't see any archers, so I'll just skip to the heavy enemies. In the trailer, we see 6 types of heavy enemies, and 7 if you count different variants of enemies. We see the Guardian Stalker, Guardian Skywatcher, Moblin, Style Moblin, Yiga Blade Master, Ice Wizrobe, and Lionel. Unlike the basic enemies, difficulty of the heavy enemies will vary between each one. Moblin and Style Moblins will have the same lowest heavy difficulty, and a weak point gauge after you do some big swing or something. In the trailer, we see Mipha doing a finish on a Guardian Stalker. If you break the Guardian's weak point gauge as Mipha, this cool attack will activate. Then the Guardian Skywatchers would be a little bit more powerful than the Guardian Stalkers, as they can fly in the air and shoot more lasers. Now this shot of Urbosa fighting a Yiga Blade Master could be her doing one of 2 things. She could be weakening the Blade Master with the Flurry Rush so she can attack the weak point gauge. The other possibility is she is damaging the weak point gauge, but we just can't see it to polish up the trailer. Now we only get a screenshot of the Ice Wizrobe, so I can't decide where its weak point gauge is. Then, just like the Wizrobe, I can't figure out how you'd activate the weak point gauge. All I know is that the Lionel will be the hardest heavy enemy if it isn't a boss. Speaking of bosses, I'll go over all the bosses that could be in the game. The only boss we can clearly see is the Hinox, but we should get more than one boss. So we could get Stone Talus, Malduga, the Blight Ganons, and maybe some new bosses. Just like the heavy enemies, the bosses have weak point gauges. But in the original Hyrule Warriors, you would have to use an item like the hookshot or the bow to activate the gauge. But in Breath of the Wild, there weren't any classic items like that, so you have to activate the gauge another way. Bows are in Breath of the Wild, they're just not a main item, so maybe you can hit the Hinox in the eye to activate the weak point gauge. We do see Daruk doing a weak point gauge finish on a Hinox, so they couldn't just remove it from the bosses. Now, enough about the enemies. Let's see what kinds of soldiers and playable characters are in the game. Now, the playable characters are just that, playable characters, but another cool thing in the original Hyrule Warriors game was that you get hundreds of thousands of soldiers fighting by your side to express the feeling of war, since you're going against hundreds of thousands of Bokoblins and other enemies. Throughout the trailer, we can see 4 kinds of friendly soldiers: Hylian Swordsman, a Hylian using a spear, Gerudo Swordswoman, and the Zora Spear Soldier. This is interesting, as in the original Hyrule Warriors, it was just swordsmen and archers on each side, but here we can see swords and spears. Each of the soldier races we can see in the trailer have their own unique swords, shields, bows, 2-handed weapons, and spears in Breath of the Wild. So there could be way more types of friendly soldiers on our side. Now we have the playable characters. In the original Hyrule Warriors, half the playable characters were villains. That is probably going to change in Age of Calamity, as really the only proper villain in the Calamity is Ganon himself. And he didn't really leave the castle for the whole Calamity, so that means no playable villains. So for now, we'll just have to live with the heroes. The only characters that we can see from the trailer are Link, Zelda, Impa, Mipha, Revali, Daruk, Urbosa, and maybe the King of Hyrule, King Rome. Link's attacks would be a normal 3-sword strike, normal spin attack, a ultra spin attack for his ultimate, and 2 or 3 kinds of finishes after he breaks a weak point gauge. One of these would be when he throws a bomb at the enemies, as seen in this cutscene. Now Zelda will be different, as it seems that her attacks are all with the Sheikah Slate. The basic attacks we have seen so far are her Bomb Throw, Stasis, and Magnesis. I think Magnesis is her primary attack, as bombs are never used as a primary attack, and Stasis doesn't do damage. It just freezes enemies in time. Then one of her finishes will be using Cryonis, as seen in this screenshot. Then there's Mipha. I think her basic attack will be her swinging her spear, kind of like one of Lana's weapons from the original Hyrule Warriors. We see Mipha's finish on a Guardian Stalker, which looks similar to a boss finish in OG Hyrule Warriors. Now Revali's basic attack is shown here, where he bombards enemies with arrows, but we don't see him do any other attacks, and I can't think of any, so let's go to Daruk. We see Daruk's boss finish, but that's it. We can also get a good perspective on his basic attack from this cutscene in the Champion's Ballad. Then there's Urbosa. We see her flurry rushing a Yiga Blade Master. I don't know if this will be exclusive to Urbosa and Link or not, because we do see Urbosa's normal attack in the flurry rush, which is the same as Link's 3-sword swing. Then there are the 2 odd ones out, the young Impa and King Rome. We never saw young Impa before this trailer, and we have no perspective on her attacks, and although we see normal Rome in Breath of the Wild, and we know that he's a warrior, we never see Rome in action or even with a weapon, so I have no ideas on King Rome and Impa's attacks. Do you have any ideas on their attacks or other characters' attacks or just something like that? Writing in the comments below. School just started back up for me, so there won't be as constant videos. If you did like this video or any other videos, then like the video. And I'll see you all later.